Welcome to the AIER's Authors Corners podcast. I'm your host, Ethan Yang, and today we have a very exciting and relevant guest today, Michael Tanner from the Cato Institute. He is a specialist in debt and entitlement reform. And today, as we all know, that we've spent trillions of dollars in just the last year alone trying to send stimulus checks and save the economy during COVID-19. And as the vaccine rollout continues and society gradually returns to normal, I think we should start to think about and grapple with the amount of debt that we've not only accumulated this year, but over the past few decades. And Michael Tanner is an expert in that subject. And he has published a book back in 2015 called Going for Broke, which talks a lot about the debt as well as the various issues when it comes to solving this crisis, as well as some reforms that we can take when it comes to our entitlement programs, which he will explain is one of the main driving forces when it comes to our national debt. So without further ado, Michael, how are you?
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
Of course, and thanks for joining us as well. So let's get right into it. You focus a lot on the need to reduce the national debt, which is now over $28 trillion. When you published this book back in 2015, it was around $18 trillion. How and why has this level of debt become acceptable?
Well, I think it's kind of a slow drip type of thing. Each individual expenditure benefits somebody, but the debt is kind of a diffuse cost that's over all society, and it doesn't hit us until sometime in the future. We don't know exactly when that date will be, so we sort of discount it. It's sometime off to go. So it becomes very difficult to try to crack down on expenditures or to raise taxes. I mean, you can argue about which of those is better, but both of those involve some level of pain, and politicians are by nature allergic to pain on a sort of bipartisan basis.
And many of your intellectual opponents would argue that governments are not like private households. A country like the US with its own sovereign currency can afford to go trillions into debt. However, you point out that not only is that not sustainable, but holding debt has negative consequences in and of itself, such as reduced economic growth, reduced sovereignty, reduced investor confidence, and so on. Can you elaborate more on these problems associated with just holding on to this much debt?
Sure. I mean, first we should recognize that in the short run, debt is not necessarily always a terrible thing. You do run into circumstances in which a certain amount of debt is going to be necessary to deal with things like wars, natural disasters, something like COVID. So, running a short-term debt budget deficit is almost inevitable. There's very little way to sort of freeze balanced budgets in place. The problem is when you run that debt year after year, decade after decade, it just continues to compound. And at some point, that debt simply begins to weigh on the economy and to become difficult to reconcile, particularly if interest rates go back up. Right now, of course, interest rates are absurdly low. That has to do with the fact that a lot of the rest of the world's in even worse shape than us. I mean, the euro isn't necessarily your best bet right now. Nobody, wants to buy rubles. The renminbi is, not really doing gangbusters. We're kind of the fastest horse in the glue factory at this point. So people are willing to lend us money, and that means that interest rates can be kept relatively low. That won't be the case forever. Eventually, interest rates will go back up. Already, interest payments are the fastest rising part of the federal budget. Those get much higher, and they begin to squeeze out all other expenditures. You can argue about what's good expenditures and what's bad, whether military spending or domestic discretionary spending, all of those sorts of things, entitlement spending. But eventually, they all begin to get crowded out by the amount of debt. We also have to look at the short-term impact. Right now, because interest rates are low, we're not seeing the squeeze, the crowding out of private borrowing. But as interest rates begin to rise again, we will see the threat to private borrowing as the government begins to take that money out of circulation and use it for its purposes, paying back interest in the debt, rather than investment that could go on in the private sector, which could increase economic growth. We also have to look at simply the fact that a lot of our debt, about half of it, is held by foreign countries, And that does have an impact on foreign policy. One of the reasons why we have to deal with China is the fact that China is one of the two largest debt holders, along with Japan, of our national debt. And so it tends to influence how we treat them and how we respond to them. And finally, of course, you have to look at, right now, investor confidence is pretty good in our debt, but it does create bubbles. It does create problems as well. The fact that interest rates are low right now allows people to borrow money and plow that into more speculative investments, then that may not always hold. You're on mute.
So one of the main concerns you outline in your book is entitlement reform, which is linked to cutting mandatory spending, not just discretionary spending. Many so-called budget hawks seem to only want to cut around the edges of discretionary spending. Budget doves want to simply increase taxes. Why is entitlement reform so important, and why are the other two approaches ineffective?
Well, they're the largest portion of federal spending. The three major entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, consume more than half of all federal spending. There really is no way to reduce federal spending significantly unless you're willing to deal with these. If you talk to politicians, their answer is always to sort of punish someone else that doesn't vote, preferably. So you get folks on the left say, well, we want to raise taxes, but not taxes on average working Americans. We're only going to raise taxes on the rich, whoever those are. And that tends to be people right above the income level of who's ever answering that question. But, if you actually confiscated, not just tax, but took 100% of all the income of all the millionaires and billionaires in America last year, you wouldn't be able to wipe out the budget deficit, let alone deal with the national debt. There's simply not enough rich people available to pay those kinds of taxes. You actually have to begin to tax people much further down the income scale than people realize. People talk about the 1%. People don't realize that that's people earning about $300,000 a year as a family. In many cases, that's two professional workers earning incomes. On the right, we're going to cut spending, but only for things that we really don't like. So we're going to defund Planned Parenthood, or we're going to slash foreign aid. Foreign aid is 1% of federal spending. You go to these sort of usual suspects, but they're not going to achieve any real budget balance. If you want to do something, you're going to have to deal ultimately with these entitlements. Social Security is about $46 trillion in the red, using a discounted present value going forward over the infinite horizon. This $46 trillion is a lot of money. And that's actually probably in better shape than Medicare, which is a little bit trickier to project, but there's at least 50, 55, $60 trillion in the red. Medicaid is funded generally by general revenues, but it's rising rapidly as well. So all of these things are adding up to an enormous cost that someday will come due. We just don't know exactly when that will be.
And just so our listeners are clear, can you describe the difference between mandatory spending and discretionary spending?
Yeah, a lot of people get mad when I talk about entitlements, and especially seniors, and say, look, I paid into the system. This is not a welfare program. There are many aspects of Social Security and Medicare that are welfare-like. But entitlement doesn't mean that. Entitlement simply means it's a mandatory program. That is, people are entitled by law to a certain level of benefits, and unless that law is changed, Congress must pay for them, whatever it is. There's no annual appropriation. Congress doesn't vote each year on how much to spend on Social Security, how much to spend on Medicare, or large portions of Medicaid. Those things are simply baked in the cake, and whatever it takes to spend, they have to spend that amount. Ironically, in fact, actual welfare, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Family Program, TANF, is not an entitlement. Congress actually has to vote on how much they're going to spend on that and change the benefits. So people, I think, just kind of misunderstand what an entitlement is.
And so Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, these are some of the big elephants in the room that nobody wants to address, as you just mentioned. So you write about how they continue to expand, providing a little benefit in return. So why do they keep expanding? Can you explain like why these programs don't actually accomplish the goals that they are purported to accomplish? And what are some reforms that we can take to fix that?
Well, one reason they expand is that they're built essentially on age, and we're aging as a society. There are more and more retirees every year. We're living longer. Those retirees are living longer and therefore collecting more benefits every year. So we have more people collecting more benefits for a longer period of time. That's simply going to expand the program. The problem is that they're essentially built like a pyramid scheme, and you can only continue to pay those more and more benefits if you have more and more people at the bottom of the pyramid paying into the system or paying more into the system. And we have fewer workers. People are having fewer babies, and that means there are fewer children growing up to become workers. If you go back to 1950, let's say, you had about 16 workers who were paying taxes in order to support one retiree in the system. That means you could keep the taxes relatively low on each of those workers. Well, today you're down to about 3 workers who are going to have to support each retiree. That raises the amount of taxes that each of those workers has to pay considerably. And by the time I get to retire, or certainly by the time you get to retire, we're going to be down slightly under 2 workers who will have to work to support you. That means each of you, you're going to have to take your retirement benefits, essentially divide them by half, and each worker has to pay that. That's a significant tax burden on each worker. The question is, how long are workers going to be continuing to be willing to pay those kind of expenses out there? The second part of this is that if you look at the benefits that those provide, because they're linked so much to wages of the working population, they grow about as fast as wages grow. But wages grow slower than the return on capital tends to grow. Pretty much historically and in the worldwide basis, capital always tends to earn a higher rate of return than does wages, labor, essentially. And that means that the benefits you're receiving are lower than they would be if you were able to invest that in capital investments in some way.
And in your book, you talk about this idea, at least when it comes to reforming Social Security, allowing individuals to have essentially these deposit accounts. I think Senator Ted Cruz once proposed that sort of reform. Why is that a better way of doing it than the way that we have now, where everyone just kind of pays into a general fund?
Sure. Well, in part, it's not so much because of the general fund, it's because those funds would actually be invested in real assets that earn a rate of return. When you pay your Social Security taxes today, none of that money is actually saved for your retirement. All the money that you pay into Social Security benefits goes right out the door immediately to pay for people who are already retired. You're essentially paying grandma's retirement benefits. And then you're hoping that when you get to be retired, someone will be paying taxes into the system that'll support you. As I say, it's very much like a pyramid scheme. The problem is that there's a lot of grandmas and not a lot of yous out there, and certainly even fewer of your kids to support you when you get to be retired. What we want to do is, when we talk about individual accounts for Social Security, is changing that to a system in which at least some of the money that you pay in actually is saved for your retirement. And not just saved, but actually invested in something that earns a rate of return, so that you can be so your retirement benefits can be based on the returns to capital equity, in essence, which have been pretty significant. Historically, the rate of return in real dollars has been somewhere in the area around 6.5–7%, even including various recessions, depressions, wars, and economic downturns over time.
And then in your book, you talk about how there's a lot of different vested interests that would like to keep the system how it is. So why do you think that is, and why haven't we just embraced the system that you just talked about?
Well, partly because we've already created the system. I mean, if we're setting out to create a system from scratch, I think we'd create a very different system than we have right now. But because we already have this system, any transition to system is going to create a certain number of losers in this. And it would be remarkably unfair, actually, to seniors who have depended on the current system to suddenly yank the rug out from under them. So we're going to have to create some sort of, we're going to have to preserve their system. That means we're going to have to continue to find ways to pay their benefits. Well, for young people, that in turn means that they're going to end up having to finance their own benefits plus pay grandma's benefits. During that transition, it's going to create a double taxation problem. And there's not much we can do about that. Basically, young people are screwed. I mean, we have lied to them. We have treated them poorly over the years, and we've created a system that doesn't work for them. Second, we have to look at the fact that there is a certain welfare component to Social Security benefits, in that if you're lower income, you receive a higher benefit per dollar paid in than if you're an upper income person. In theory, this is supposed to provide a certain progressivity within the Social Security system. Over time, this doesn't tend to work out because longevity also tends to be based on income. Essentially, the more money you earn, the longer you're likely to live, and this tends to offset this progressive benefit formula. But you got to find a way to deal with that within the system as well.
Of course, and I thank you for your bleak honesty when it comes to the future of young people and our Social Security. Another huge point you bring up, and this is obviously a very contentious topic and obviously a favorite punching bag for people on this side of the aisle. You bring up the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare. You talk about how it's highly expensive, but also ineffective, and it's in some ways made things worse. For those who maybe haven't studied it in depth, why is that, and what are some reforms that you propose?
Yeah, essentially, what Obamacare did was to take the current system and simply pour more subsidies into it. The subsidies for insurers, the subsidies for individuals, subsidies for pharmaceutical companies. Basically, they didn't reform the system at all. They simply shifted around who was paying for it more to taxpayers. Now, that does have benefits. People who were low income, people who are receiving the subsidies, did find that they were able, they were having the taxpayers pick up part of the cost of their coverage, which expanded coverage and did have some benefits. In addition, what it did was it basically shifted the cost for people with pre-existing conditions. That is, people, we think a lot about pre-existing conditions, but it basically means somebody who's already sick. It's not insurance at that point. It's just simply paying their medical bills. And if they had to pay them themselves, that's pretty expensive. If they hadn't bought insurance and they got sick, they were in trouble when it came to that. So Obamacare essentially shifted those costs to people who already had insurance, who people who had bought insurance previously, raised their premiums. Particularly if you were young and healthy, your premiums went up. If you're older and sicker, your premiums went down. So there's a lot of moving money around within the system under Obamacare. What it didn't do was fundamentally change the system, and that is that we have a system right now that essentially basically encourages people to receive medical care and subsidizes that medical care for them, and then at the same time restricts the supply of medical care in various ways in order to raise costs. It's a system that's sort of designed to benefit the medical providers at the expense, frankly, of patients. And Obamacare did very little to change that. So now you're facing premiums in many cases that are, $34,500, $40,000 a year for an Obamacare policy. If your income's low enough, you get that offset by subsidies. The argument then becomes, well, what level should the subsidies be at? If your income's too high to qualify for those subsidies, or for some other reason you're left out, you face an unaffordable cost for you and your family.
So you've definitely laid out a compelling case that all these entitlements are extremely expensive. Not only are they expensive, but they have staying power. If you were in charge of everything, if you had a magic wand, what are some basic policy reforms that you would recommend to get the debt under control through entitlement reform?
Yeah, essentially, I think the first thing we've got to do is be honest with people. And that is the fact that we have promised things that we can't deliver. That ultimately we are not going to be able to pay the promised level of Social Security benefits, for example. Young people are going to either pay more or receive less, or more likely both. And we need to be upfront with them about that. On Medicare, ultimately, we're going to provide fewer benefits, or again, we're going to have to make people pay more into the system. But we've promised benefits there as well that simply cannot be provided. And Medicaid and Obamacare, it's similarly true. So the very first thing I would love to do is simply be honest with the American people. And it's been a long time since we've had very many politicians willing to do this. And this is bipartisan. I mean, you can really reach back a long ways among Democrats, for example, since you had people like Bob Kerrey and John Breaux and Charlie Stenholm. I'm showing how old I am now. Going back to way back then, who were willing to talk about the need for reform. Even Bill Clinton, of course, who talked about the need for entitlement reform in the pre-Monica Lewinsky days. But now it's become Republican orthodoxy as well. Donald Trump ran for office on the idea that he was not going to cut Social Security and Medicare benefits. That those were essentially his people, older, largely white, largely working class population, and he was not going to cut their benefits. That was one of his things he was very proud of, and he certainly didn't on that. And that sort of pushed the Republican Party that way. There was very little, people who were once deficit hawks suddenly became very dovish during the Trump years. Now that the Democrats in power, we may see Republicans suddenly rediscover their deficit bona fides, but it's a little late.
So we are, like we said at the beginning of this interview, we're approaching what is probably going to be $30 trillion worth of debt and counting. A lot of the people on the progressive aisle might say that, with our sovereign currency, we can just print it away or just grow the economy so it just becomes a smaller percentage of our GDP. What is your take on the future of the country when it comes to having this much debt? And do you see any prospects in the current political atmosphere for any sort of reform in a positive direction?
Yeah, even the sort of modern monetary theorists, or the magic money tree theory, as I like to call it, don't suggest that we can spend forever. They just think you can control inflation with fiscal policy rather than with monetary policy. So even they think ultimately you run up against it. They just can do a lot more now. And it is true. They say we're at a situation right now where interest rates are very low. If you're going to borrow, this is now sort of the time to do it. And we, deficit scolds like me have, been wrong in the past about how long this could go on. It turns out the American economy is quite resilient and can continue to grow and can continue to pump along in the face of debt for a long time. The question is whether you believe this is sort of an infinite process and can go on forever. And I simply think it's not. And we're eventually going to come in for a landing. And kind of the question is whether or not you come in on a nice, gentle glide path. We take advantage of the fact that we have low interest rates right now, that the economy, post-COVID, will expect a significant economic growth, that'll give us an opportunity to sort of bring it in on a glide path, or whether we're going to go along until we come in kind of at a more vertical angle down the road. And I suspect that it may be more of the latter, simply because politically nobody wants to endure the pain right now on that.
Michael, thank you so much for a very fascinating and very illuminating talk about our debt as well as our entitlements. His book, it's called Going for Broke. It's published by our friends at the Cato Institute, and it's available on Amazon or wherever you get your books. My personal copy is a advanced reading copy, so you cannot get this specific one. So, I got ahead of the bandwagon right there. But yeah, to our listeners, thank you so much for listening, and please stay tuned for our next guest. Michael, thank you so much for coming.
It was a real pleasure anytime.